Hello guys, and welcome back to HJW Gaming. After a little bit of time away, I am back with hopefully an absolute cracker of a video. One of my previous most popular videos was my first 24-hour guide for Rise to War Classic. So with the updates that have come in Rise to War 2.0 and also the marching and UI updates, I'm hoping to bring a refreshed video with additional tips building upon that hopefully will really help you guys to achieve maximum production, especially during your first 24 hours. If you do like this, please drop a sub and please smash the like button, as it really helps get my videos out there. And with that, I really hope that you enjoy. There have been some huge changes to the first 24-hour buff. The first of these is the stamina cost for a march. So previously, the stamina cost for a march in the first 24 hours was reduced to 10 in Rise to War Classic. This meant that you could do 15 marches for your 150 stamina, discounting regeneration. With the 2.0 buff, however, marches now still take up 20 stamina and regeneration remains the same. However, the stamina pool has been doubled to 300, so you still get 15 marches discounting regeneration for your starting stamina. But what this does mean is you get half the number of additional marches as you would have previously, as you need to wait an hour for 20 stamina to regenerate rather than the previous half an hour for 10 stamina. Therefore, rather than regenerating an additional 48 marches in the first 24 hour, you only get 24. What that means is less experience, less tile taking, and therefore less resource and power generation. This is a significant slowdown during the first 24 hours. However, this does have the slight benefit to those where the season starts at an ungodly hour, as they can use some of their stamina, then go to sleep whilst the stamina takes a little while to regenerate, and there's less pressure for them to stay up all night to make the most of the buff. The second change to the first 24-hour buff is that there is no longer reduced troop losses. Previously, there was a 50% reduced death rate, meaning that more troops would go into the apothecary and therefore remain available to you rather than dying completely. This has been removed, however, in 2.0, meaning that you need to be more careful when managing your troop losses to avoid falling into a troop deficit and being unable to continue capturing tiles. The combination of these two changes means you need to be really careful, particularly when stepping up to an additional power tile as to what you've taken previously, as the additional troop losses mean you can't afford to jump up to a higher power tile too soon and lose a huge amount of troops, which will then cost you resources and time to regenerate. However, you want to step up as soon as possible and not stay on low power tiles for too long, as the reduced number of marches due to the stamina change means you need to be as efficient as possible with taking tiles. Due to this lower number of tiles being able to be taken due to the lower marches, it's also likely that you're going to hit a resource bottleneck more often in your first 24 hours, so don't be frustrated by this, as it will be happening to everyone. Of course, having lower power tiles or fewer tiles than previous is of course going to mean less resource generation and therefore less resources to continue your chapter progression, so just be prepared for this when it comes. There are two other elements associated with the first 24-hour buff, though I don't really have any tips to go along with these, but I will mention them. The first of which is the reinforcement buff, which means that when you reinforce your army, it doesn't have a stamina cost attached during that first 24 hours. And the second of which is the no collision, unless you choose to attack an enemy tile, in which case you will lose that collision buff. So make sure you don't click that and remove the collision buff. What this means is that if your army or your reinforcements cross across a player of another fellowship, or just another player who's not in your own fellowship, they won't just automatically go to war as part of the new marching system. So make sure not to remove that, And of course, you can feel free to reinforce within that first 24 hours as much as you want. But once you move outside of that first 24 hours, make sure you keep both of these in mind, as you will now have to be careful of both collisions and of wasting 5 stamina every single time you reinforce. So if you get ahead in the first 24 hours, you don't want either of these to then cost you continuing your progression throughout the season. In my original guide, I explained that what you should do with resources is prioritise troop conscription over building in order to keep troop numbers up, so you can take more tiles and constantly sweep for more resources to make sure you're constantly progressing. Without troops, of course, everything grinds to a halt. However, in 2.0, I think there needs to be a somewhat more balanced mindset. Due to the ability, which I will touch on later, for commanders to take tiles with significantly less than maximum command of troops, and this actually being a more efficient way of taking tiles, I think that progression through your individual chapters, through getting the required buildings, should instead be prioritised. That way you can get the additional tile availability from the chapter progression and the bonus resources that come as a result. However, this does come with a caveat that you will need to still keep a close eye on troop levels to ensure you can still march and can still continue using up your stamina to take the highest level tiles possible, and also have commanders that can sweep as well. One tip for conscripting troops faster in 2.0 is that you can now fill your conscription queues with multiple of the same troop. So if you're conscripting a single troop type, do so in multiple small batches rather than a single big batch. For example, if you're looking to conscript 1,000 tier 2 spearmen, instead of just putting 1 hour and a half long conscription of 1,000 troops, instead do 4 batches of 250 and you'll get those in a quarter of the time, which is significantly more useful and will save you a lot of time in the long run. As for which troops you should prioritise, same as previous, I'd always recommend training a universal troop. This is a troop that can be used reasonably well by almost all of your commanders, so therefore you can just keep producing this troop and use it across all of your formations and armies. If you use a lot of damage commanders, this can be very useful, as you can just train a single tanky unit and use it across all of your damage commanders, which is very, very useful. Switching back to building prioritisation, previously I always recommended prioritising the military academy so that you could get the maximum number of troops onto your commanders as possible and take those bigger tiles earlier. However, I now recommend, as I said earlier, prioritising the buildings that will continue your chapter progression, because therefore you get the bonus resources and the bonus tile allocation, which is far more useful than the additional troops on your commanders, as often you will actually be using commanders without the maximum allocation of troops, which, as I said, I will be detailing later on. So the military academy, in my opinion, is no longer the top priority. Instead, things like conscription queue, barracks and main hall should be prioritised instead. I would also recommend early on, particularly during the first 24 hours, not wasting valuable resources building the various different additional troop buildings, for example the Dwarven Footman Yurt or the Hunter's Range. Reason for this is you should just be able to get by at the beginning using that universal troop that you start with. And upgrading those buildings to a suitable standard to get, say, tier 2 troops during that first day costs a significant amount of resource, and that would be better put towards improving, say, your main hall, your barracks or your conscription building. Similarly, I'd recommend focusing on one specific type of quarters and not going through multiple. So for example, in a King of Men server you have both the Númenórean and the Eastern quarters unlocked for men and evil men units respectively. I'd recommend focusing and upgrading only one of these and deciding which best suits your commanders. Upgrading both would once again just be a drain of your resources, which can be better used elsewhere. Now, last up, in regards to building, I want to talk about the market and its correlation with efficient resource use. Now, there will come a point in that first day, pretty early on, where you unlock the market for the first time, and it will be very tempting to ease up resource bottlenecks, very likely stone bottlenecks, by going into the market and using the barter function. Now, at the beginning, the barter function will allow you to exchange 100 of a certain resource for 40 of a different chosen resource. Now this is extremely inefficient, as of course you're losing 60% of the resource that you're exchanging. This is extremely inefficient, and whilst early on it might feel like a good idea to free up from a stone bottleneck, for example, to keep you building, it can however cause you to then bottleneck later on and not be able to conscript troops if you instead sacrifice grain, iron or wood instead. The only resource I would ever really recommend doing an exchange, a barter for, if you really require another resource, is exchanging grain, as of course you can sweep in order to get additional grain. You don't just have to wait for it to regenerate, though I still wouldn't recommend doing this, as losing 60% of that overall resource is extremely bad value. However, as with anything in this game, there is significant advantage to be had for those that are fairly high spending players. Now within the market's merchant function, there is exchanges that can be had by spending gold and silver ingots. Now gold and silver ingots are gained by going into the Matham house and recycling your equipment. And how much equipment you recycle will get you a certain amount of ingots. Now for those who aren't aware, the market actually levels up. And as you level up your market, you do gain additional things in the market, and in the later levels you also gain better preferential rates for the barter function. For example, at level 12 you increase your resource trade rate from 100 to 40 to 100 to 46, and this continues all the way up to level 30, where you can increase your resource trade rate to 80%. The way you level up your market primarily is through buying things within the market. So when you spend in here, it does gain some XP along the bar at the top and therefore level up your market. However, the small plus next to this XP bar can allow you to upgrade manually by spending additional ingots. So those who are high spending can very early on, even in that first day, upgrade their market straight away up to level 30 and therefore gain that 100 to 80 resource trade rate, and therefore have a significant resource advantage on other players who do not have the resources or money to spend in order to get this. If you're a high spender and money is no object, this could be worth doing to get that high power advantage early on, or high resource advantage, which therefore should allow you to break through resource bottlenecks a lot easier. Though of course this is a very expensive way of going about doing it, and I would not recommend it for the average player. I just wanted to flag it up for those who may be willing to do so, as of course this would form part of being as efficient as possible in the first 24 hours and getting top of the leaderboard if you wanted to pull out all the stops in order to get there. During the first 24 hours, the commanders you choose to use in your formation do not have to be the main commanders that you're going to use in PvP later on in the season. These commanders used in your formation only have to be the best available for PvE or sweeping, depending on what you're using the formation for at that respective time. As for which commander is best to use, you should make sure your commander synergizes well with the troop you have decided to start with. So for example, in a King of Men server, it's not uncommon to be using the tier 2 spearmen for quite a long time. In that case, there's no point using a commander such as Gil-galad, who relies on elves for his significant skills, and also bloodline does not synergize at all. Whereas you could use a different commander such as Isildur or Aragorn King of Men, who synergizes well using men troops. Damage commanders can be very good for this at the beginning, as you can just train that universal tank unit as I said, and they'll perform well regardless of this unit. Now I mentioned it briefly there as well. Keep an eye on your commander's bloodline skill. This is found within their skills menu and is a passive buff if you use the correct unit on that commander. Now if these synergize with your troop, you can get some good bonus attack and defense from the bloodline skill, which can have a huge impact actually on lower tier troops. For example, plus 7.5 defense on a troop, if it's a tier 1 troop at the beginning that only has 15 defense, this is a massive buff. So this is what I mean by you need to make sure the commander you're using at the beginning is just the best PvE commanders you have. It doesn't necessarily have to be the PvP ones, it just has to be those that synergize best with your troop and are best for taking tiles. The principles for which commanders are best for PvE have changed slightly as well. Previously in Rise to War Classic, the commanders that you always saw used were those that had excellent healing, such as Gandalf the Grey, as this could minimise the amount of troops you lost by constantly recovering them with the heals. However, with healing taking a significant backstep in 2.0, in addition to the previously used mounted formation with the ally healing being nerfed, we don't see healing being anywhere near as strong in PvE tiling. Therefore, there's now a couple of key principles whilst building your PvE formation. First of which is damage reduction, which should be your top priority. You need to make sure you have at least one commander in there which provides an excellent amount of damage reduction. A good example of these are Gandalf the White or Gandalf the Grey with high focus and using the White Council skill so they can massively mitigate the amount of damage taken by the other commanders in your formation. The rest of the prioritization should then go towards damage. Now, commanders who can provide a large amount of early round damage will be best here, as they can kill off a lot of the opponent's troops before they can inflict damage on you. Excellent examples of these are, say, Skullhelm with a refined unique, which can hit for 1500% damage in the pre-battle phase, and also Witch King with Ringwraith possibly inflicting a stun, but also inflicting a lot of damage in that pre-battle phase, which can be excellent for just getting ahead early on. Other strong options for good damage will include some of the Dwarven commanders like Dane and Gimli, where they have good damage skills that go off within the first couple of rounds before Durin's Blood hits in round 3 or so. Usually you want a combination of that damage reduction previously mentioned with a lot of these high damage commanders, and therefore you should take the tiles relatively easily. Another tip from Rise to War Classic was to not use too many commanders and level them up simultaneously, as instead you could risk using up too many of your troops. However, in Rise to War 2.0, I would recommend using 2 different armies for tiling, and then use as many other armies as possible to sweep with whilst they regenerate stamina. The reason you can afford to have a load of extra sweep armies is because you can do sweeping now without losing very many troops, and this will be the low troop method that I detail later on and I've mentioned previously. Whilst utilising multiple formations, you should always utilise a method called leapfrogging on your commanders. Now, from a troop perspective, this is a standard tip from previous guides, and what it means is if you're taking tiles and you need your commander at maximum troops, you can strip troops off of all of one army and then move them onto your second army whilst you're not using the first. This means that therefore you can always have maximum troops and you're not sending your commander out with half army. However, you can also now leapfrog gear between your commanders in Rise to War 2.0. With gear familiarity, meaning the penalty you used to suffer when you swapped new gear onto your commander being removed, there's now no reason not to always use the best gear on the formations that you're currently using. So for the purposes of PvE, you can keep one set of your best gear and swap this between multiple armies. For example, if you use your main army formation to take tiles until you're out of stamina, you can then remove all of your best gear from them and equip this to your second army. This ensures that your second army then also has the best possible gear, which will increase their damage and therefore minimise troop losses, allowing you to take bigger tiles earlier with multiple armies and keep that production as high as possible. It's easier if your formations in both armies have a similar structure, so the gear synergizes well with both formations. One of my best tips for starting Rise to War 2.0, and as a brand new tip, is what I term slingshot leveling for your commanders. What this means is, because your armies now contain multiple formations, which can be of different levels, you can level a few commanders so they're able to take higher level tiles easier, then add a low level commander formation alongside these to essentially feed off any additional experience gained from the overall strong army, taking a tile that far exceeds what that army would be able to take if it was, used on its own, basically. So for example, a formation of 2 level 20 commanders and a single level 5 could easily take a 90 power tile, which would then give the level 5 experience from a 90 power tile, whereas an army of all level 5s would be unlikely to take a tile any stronger than 15 power. So why is this useful? You can therefore get more experience to your lower level commanders at a significantly less stamina cost. We can therefore exploit this, so you can begin your season by using your quote-unquote second commanders, getting them leveled up, and then you can sub in one of your main formation commanders and power level them using this method, so their first tile taken, for example, could be the experience from a 90 power tile rather than 15, and you will get them leveled up significantly quicker, so during the back end of your first 24-hour period you'll be taking stronger tiles much quicker. This might mean slightly slower progression in the early hours, but you'll see significant advantage in the later stage of the first day when you have higher level main commanders than your rivals and you still have stamina left, so you can take significantly more higher power tiles early on. The only thing to bear in mind with this is if you do start with your second formation to do this, don't just let your main commanders sit there on maximum stamina being wasted. It might be wise to just take 1 or 2 lower power tiles with them just so that stamina is regenerating, then start using this slingshot method with the second army. Let me know if I've explained this fully well enough. If I haven't, drop down in the comments and I'll consider doing a separate video on this, as I think it's one of the best tips to get the maximum production early on. Whilst I've mentioned stamina as well, another thing to bear in mind is that stamina tinctures for your commanders can only serve one commander. So be aware of this and only use it on your main few. I believe there is 4 or 5 stamina tinctures available at the beginning of the game, and then they're not available again for a couple of days. Now, ring skills are one of those things that I get asked about pretty regularly. How best to allocate your ring points to make sure you get the most efficiency from them. And there's not really any one size fits all, but here are kind of like my tips that I would recommend following in order to make the best use of your ring skills. Now, the first of which is always to make sure dominance is maximised, just so you can have the maximum number of tiles possible at each given moment. A new point can be put into this every 10 ring levels, so make sure to keep an eye on this whenever you go over one of those milestones. As of course, more tiles means more power and more resource available to you. I also get asked a lot if the extract function is worth taking. Now, previously I didn't recommend this, however I think in 2.0 extract is actually more valuable than it was previously, so I now kind of can recommend taking this, despite the fact that it becomes obsolete after you get the gather function at ring level 10. The reason for this is, with the changes to the buff, you will be slower taking tiles and therefore be generating less resource than previous classic seasons. You'll therefore be more likely to hit a resource bottleneck, and very likely that resource bottleneck will be stone, and an extract or two can help you to continue progressing. The secondary benefit of this is that ability points are a regenerating resource, so using a few of these points sooner can get them regenerating, and you're not wasting by having them at max all the way until you hit ring level 10. I usually use at least one gather once I have a 40 power stone tile, just to help me get through a resource bottleneck early on, and then try not to use extract again from then on. Up until you hit ring level 10, I'd recommend putting any remaining spare points into Abundant Might, but then being prepared for when you hit ring level 10 to respec your ring completely. If you're playing the Kings of Men campaign, there is the previously available conversion skill, which is still on offer. However, in my opinion, it's not worth taking this at the beginning unless you desperately need it in order to get a commander operational. For example, getting elf mobs in to use Gil Galad. Though, in my opinion, it's still better to use universal troops on a universal commander and not waste ring skills picking up this skill, as of course it is a waste, and I would instead put any spare ring points into Abundant Might just to get that bonus attack, as I think 10 ability points in order just to get in a couple of troops that of course will expire, and you won't keep for as long as you used to anyway, as you no longer have the healing buff within the 24-hour buff, I just think it's a very poor waste of 10 ability points. Once you hit ring level 10, you should respec your ring completely in order to put a point into enormous power, take the gather function, and then put any additional spare points into enormous power, so you have as many ability points as possible. And all ability points from your minimum to your maximum always regenerates at the same rate, so you get 100% of your points back every 24 hours. So you want to have as many points as possible in enormous power, so you have a higher number of overall ability points, and therefore each individual point regenerates faster. So once you've got gather, any remaining points into enormous power. And from then on, I'd still carry on that prioritization. Once you've filled up enormous power, make sure your points go into dominance, anything left over into abundant might. As far as Tavern tips go, it's no longer worth it to wait until 11:59 UTC on the first day to take your tips. For those who are unaware, you used to be able to take your tips on the last possible minute of the day, just before refresh, and therefore your tips would last, I think it's 48 hours from then onwards, so you would hope that the chapters would progress up to a point where your tips would then start generating experience, and you could use this to level your commanders. This is no longer worth it, as firstly, due to the changes in the buff, as aforementioned, tiles are being taken at a slower rate, and therefore chapter progression is slower, so it's unlikely that you would hit this 48-hour point before your tips would expire. But the other main thing is that a lot of tips now no longer generate experience. So you would just be waiting and wasting these tips away for no reason at all, when there's not experience to be gained from doing this. So if you have your Tavern tips, feel free just to take them and complete them, as this can be beneficial to you. Of course, having a little bit of extra respect can be beneficial. As far as the resource cart tip goes, I would recommend using your resource tip when you hit the resource bottleneck that cannot be resolved with chapter progression. So where you'd usually be tempted to use a little bit of the market or spend a few additional ring points, instead just use this. You can use this Tavern tip to get that additional thing of resources. I believe on the first day it's 10k of each resource once completed, and that way you can just ease yourself out of resource bottleneck and keep yourself continuing. Between power levels, there are some significant jump ups in difficulty when taking tiles that you should be aware of. The first of these is between 15 and 30 power tiles, which is where the opposing tile's army will go from having 2 formations to 3. So therefore the number of armies you have to defeat does increase, and of course the number of troops and their capacity for damage. Therefore, I'd recommend waiting until you have barracks level 5, which is where you unlock the ability to have 3 armies within your formation in order to also counter against this. Of course, that doesn't take very long to get to, as that is right at the beginning of the season, but nonetheless I'd recommend rushing to barracks level 5 and getting that additional army within your formation. This happens again between 90 and 130 power, and this is actually a huge jump up, as going from 3 to 4 armies within the formation adds a hell of a lot of difficulty, and also there is an enormous step up in the opponent's gear strength. So don't take a 130 power tile until you're taking 90s with almost no loss, because I think you'll be surprised at the amount of difficulty jump up. Additionally, I could also recommend waiting until you have barracks level 11 before you try and take on a 130 power tile. Barracks level 11 is the next stepway, where you gain an additional army to your formation so you can match up 4v4. The only time I'd recommend maybe having a slight exception to this is if you are bottlenecked on your chapter progression, because you do require a 130 power tile to continue your chapter. In which case it may be worth taking a single 130 power tile and just taking the additional losses, even if you have only 3 armies within your formation. Though I wouldn't recommend doing this until you're taking 90s similarly with near to no loss. I think this comes around level 20-ish, maybe 22. Of course, it depends on respect and gear level as well, so only you can make that judgment. I personally also find there's a slight difficulty jump between 40 power and 60 whenever I've come to experience it. I think this is because the Tile Army's gear steps up so they have matching sets and also start getting some refines. So the gear does jump up a little bit, but I've always found the jump between 40 and 60 to be slightly more difficult. This could just be my own personal experience though, but I'd recommend keeping an eye out for it nonetheless. Another thing to be aware of is to be very careful about the strength of tile that you're sending at due to a change in the tile's refresh rates. Previously in Classic, tiles would refresh every 15 minutes, which means after you hit them, you'd have 15 minutes to take down that tile. At that time, you could afford to draw multiple times or to recall, reinforce, and then march again. The refresh rate, however, has now been significantly shortened to 6 minutes in 2.0 following the March update. So be aware that you can only afford one draw, or keep an eye on your march times or your reinforcement times if you're choosing to hit the tile twice. Another change to the March update is the way that your commanders can move around the map. Due to the necessity to capture crossings, tunnels and other pathing points before your commanders can move around, I would think very hard about where you start your location at the start of seasons, as areas with a high number of crossings will now be a hindrance, as you cannot march to friendly tiles on the opposite side of rivers, etc. without capturing crossings as you could previously. This can really impact your tile availability at the beginning if you're trapped between, say, a mountain range and a bunch of rivers. Areas such as Tower Lower, for example, which is known for its large amount of rivers, can be a nightmare if you spawn there, as you can have a very low number of tiles available to you. Now we finally get to a part that I've mentioned a few times throughout this video, and this is the way to minimise troop loss whilst you're taking tiles. Now in Rise to War 2.0, commanders within your formation now have their own HP pool, which in itself is a resource that you should seek to use to the maximum so that you can reduce the number of troop losses. What I mean by this is, when you attack a tile, you want to try and have the minimum possible number of troops on your commanders so that when all the troops die and the opponent is attacking onto your commander's HP, they use up as much of that HP as possible, but without your commanders dying. As of course, you don't want to fail the tile and have to send another army, therefore wasting stamina. So this is quite a delicate balance. Now, tips for how you get this to work. You have to be using damage dealing commanders, as of course if you're using troop support commanders, they're not going to deal any damage with a very minimal number of troops allocated to them. So you have to be using damage dealing commanders. You also want to skill these commanders for as much damage as possible in the very, very early rounds, as if all their damage comes late on, of course they will be having hits on their HP and they'll probably be dead before the time comes for them to deal that damage, so you want high early round damage. Gear wise, you want to make sure you have as much HP giving gear as possible, so that includes chest, headpiece, potentially even accessory, just giving them the maximum amount of HP so they can survive as many hits as possible and therefore deal as much damage as possible without getting wiped out, basically, as you don't want to fail the tile. Lastly, when you take a tile, make sure to allow your commander's HP to fully regenerate before you move on to the next one. This can be done by either recalling the commander or reinforcing and using the apothecary tinctures to heal your commander, or through just waiting an allotted period of time for that HP to regenerate regardless. But you don't want to then go into taking another tile with a reduced amount of HP, as of course you then risk failure once again. But due to letting your commander take the hits and reducing that HP, which regenerates very, very quickly, you of course don't have to use as many troops as you would previously, which means of course less troops dying and therefore less resource needed to conscript troops. So the better your gear, again this is a method that will really benefit those high spending players, as the better your gear in particular makes a huge difference, so you can get high refines and get that high HP gear, allowing your commander to take multiple hits, and also high respect levels so you can put a lot of skills into damage very early on. So the big spenders will benefit from this the most. However, that doesn't mean that everyone can't benefit from it. So yeah, you want to be using this as much as possible to reduce your troop loss and therefore spend those resources instead on buildings and chapter progression. For sweeping, I'd recommend always sweeping the lowest level mob possible and using only a single troop on your commanders. So therefore, for the cost of only 4 troops, mounted units are good for this as they travel across the map quicker as well. But you could use almost anything, but for the trade-off of those 4 troops, you therefore get a large amount of grain for winning the sweep, and you can therefore do this with as many armies as you want. Just keep filling up 4 commanders, putting gear on them, skilling them up, and just keep sweeping the lowest level mobs possible, and you can just keep that grain flowing in, which you can then use to conscript troops, and of course, using the barter system, get yourself out of resource bottlenecks. From day 1 of your season, there are items available in the various stores that would definitely benefit you, particularly during that first 24 hours. So I'm going to quickly cover here which ones I think are the most useful and which ones I'd recommend. Of course, you don't have to do this, there's no requirement to do this. However, again, it can just help you be as efficient as possible if you're looking to top that leaderboard. Sorry to the free-to-play players out there that some of which these may not be able to pick these up. But I'll start with the daily discount store. The ones within here I would recommend picking up are Battle Readiness. The reason I'd recommend picking up as many Battle Readiness as possible, I believe there's 4 available on the first day, is you can get 4 of those resource yield bonuses from gathering. What this does is increases the resource you get from gathering by 30% and can be used up to 4 times, so you can get a lot more resource when you're gathering. Now, as I said earlier, gathering is by far the most efficient way to use your ring points, so you'll want to be gathering as much as possible to get yourself out of resource bottlenecks and prioritise that chapter progression. And this just helps enormously. Getting those bonus resource yields can of course mean you get bonus resource and get ahead of your competition that aren't using this. I'd also recommend picking up all of these resource bonuses for wood, ore, stone and grain. What these provide are a 3-hour bonus for each of their individual resources, which increases your production by 20% for 3 hours. If you use this towards the kind of middle to the end of your first 24 hours, you can again get yourself and prevent yourself getting into resource bottlenecks by having that additional 20% resource generating all the time. Next up, I'm going to talk through the construction queue purchasable. Now, in my Rise to War Classic, I said this was pretty much essential, as you always want to keep things building and using your resources and progressing as often as possible. In Rise to War 2.0, whilst I still think the construction queue is useful, I don't think it's as essential as it was in Rise to War Classic. Now, don't get me wrong, within the first few hours, you'll almost always have 3 things constructing if you have this construction queue purchasable. Particularly during the first 10-15 minutes, it can really help you, get all those early things built that just take a few seconds that you just want to absolutely fly through, and therefore you can get onto tiling that little bit sooner. So it is beneficial in that regard. I don't think it's useless at all. However, due to, again, that first 24-hour buff change, and you having less tiles, less resources generating, and therefore hitting bottlenecks more often, you're not always going to have things building. In fact, quite often I've only had 1 or 2 things building even within the first 24 hours. So therefore that construction queue isn't exactly essential. So if you're looking to save yourself a little bit of money, I don't think you have to purchase this one, though if you're looking to have the maximum benefit possible, it does still offer some good advantages. So it's up to you whether you purchase this, in my opinion. Next up is Commander's Trial. Now what this gives you is when you purchase, you get 4 Matham coins, but more importantly, you get 4 stamina tinctures. Now this one is almost essential if you're looking to get as high as possible in the first 24 hours, as of course the 4 stamina tinctures, if used on your main and best tiling commanders, will give that formation 3 extra marches, therefore 60 stamina of course, so 3 extra marches, which can give you of course 3 bonus tiles, which can equal a lot of power. If used towards the end of the day and you're taking 130 power tiles, that can make quite a difference. Of course, these aren't as effective as they were. They've kind of had a stealth nerf, if you think about it. They're not as effective as they were in the previous seasons in Rise to War Classic, as when stamina was changed to, when marches, were reduced to 10 stamina during the first 24 hours, these stamina tinctures would give you an enormous 6 additional marches. Whereas now you only just get the 3, which in my opinion sucks a little bit as they're still charging exactly the same price for these, which I don't think is great from them. But either way, these are still required if you want to get the maximum possible advantage in that first 24 hours. And last but not least is the resource bonus purchasable. This follows very similar to the kind of daily tip one with the resource yield, in that this grants 4 Matham coins, but more importantly, 1 8-hour production bonus for each of the 4 resources that boosts your production by 20% for a massive 8 hours. So between that and the daily purchasable, you can get 11 hours of plus 20% production, which of course is a huge boost for you during that first 24 hours. So I would definitely recommend getting this, as if you have 20% more resource than lots of your fellow peers, you'll of course hit significantly less resource bottlenecks. So yeah, this is a really key one in my opinion. Of course, I'll always caveat that you never need to purchase. This is only if you're looking to be as efficient as possible. You can still be successful during the first day and during your season without taking any of the purchasables. That said, if you do choose to take up some of the purchasables, I do have an affiliate link available. I'll put it on the screen now, and a link will also be down in the description. So if you're looking to purchase any bundles for your new season or throughout your current season, if you could please use the link below, it would really benefit me as well. So I'd massively appreciate that. Anyway, with that, that's all the tips that I currently have. If you've liked this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button and also hitting the like button to help engage and get the content out there for everybody. And if you share it amongst your Discords, hopefully it can benefit all of your friends' fellowships as well. And with that, I've been HJW Gaming, and I really hope to see you on the next one.